The room is quiet. Too quiet. Not the comforting silence of peace, but the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Darkness has a way of sharpening attention, and so does uncertainty. Long before the modern world gave names to psychological tactics, humans learned how to influence, persuade, intimidate, and control one another. These methods did not emerge from nowhere. They grew out of survival, competition, fear, and desire. What we now call dark psychology is not a mystical force or a secret society's handbook. It is the systematic understanding of how the human mind can be influenced in ways that benefit one person at the expense of another. This documentary exists for one reason only: education. Understanding these mechanisms does not make someone dangerous. Ignoring them makes someone vulnerable. Dark psychology operates in the shadows of normal behavior. It often looks ordinary. A compliment. A question. A pause at the right moment. A subtle shift in tone. The most effective manipulation rarely feels like manipulation at all. That is its power. The human brain is built to take shortcuts. It relies on patterns, assumptions, and emotional signals to make quick decisions. These shortcuts keep us alive, but they also leave us open to exploitation. Dark psychology studies those shortcuts, identifies where they fail, and shows how they can be used to influence thoughts, emotions, and actions without overt force. At the core of dark psychology lies a simple truth. People believe they are rational, but most decisions are emotional first and logical second. Neuroscience confirms this repeatedly. The emotional centers of the brain often activate before conscious reasoning has time to intervene. This delay may last only milliseconds, but it is enough. Manipulation does not need to convince logic. It only needs to trigger emotion and let the brain justify the choice afterward. Fear, guilt, desire, pride, shame, hope. These are the levers that dark psychology pulls. One of the most fundamental principles is authority perception. Humans are conditioned from childhood to respect authority figures. Parents, teachers, doctors, leaders. When someone appears confident, knowledgeable, or dominant, the brain assigns them credibility automatically. Dark psychology exploits this by manufacturing authority. This may involve specialized language, confident body posture, controlled speech patterns, or symbolic cues such as uniforms, titles, or status markers. The content of what is said becomes less important than how it is delivered. Studies have shown that people are more likely to comply with requests simply because the requester sounds confident and certain, even when the request makes little sense. Closely related is the principle of social proof. Humans are social creatures. When unsure, we look to others for guidance. If many people appear to believe something, the brain assumes it must be correct. Dark psychology leverages this by creating the illusion of consensus. Testimonials, crowds, repeated messages, and apparent popularity all reinforce belief. Even fabricated agreement can influence perception. When a message is repeated often enough and appears to be widely accepted, resistance weakens. The mind begins to ask not whether it is true, but why so many others seem to accept it. Another powerful mechanism is reciprocity. When someone gives us something, we feel an internal pressure to give something back. This instinct is deeply ingrained across cultures. Dark psychology uses this by offering small favors, compliments, or gestures of kindness to create a sense of obligation. The favor may be insignificant, but the emotional debt feels real. Once the debt exists, compliance becomes more likely. The manipulated individual may not even realize why they feel compelled to agree. Fear is perhaps the most potent tool of all. Fear narrows focus. It reduces critical thinking. It creates urgency. When afraid, the brain seeks immediate relief rather than long-term reasoning. Dark psychology often introduces a threat, real or imagined, and then positions the manipulator as the solution. This pattern appears everywhere, from scams to cults to abusive relationships. First create anxiety. Then offer safety. The relief reinforces loyalty. Over time, the individual may become dependent on the very person who caused the fear. Guilt and shame function in a similar way. Guilt arises when we believe we have violated a moral standard. Shame attacks identity itself, making someone feel fundamentally flawed. Dark psychology uses guilt to control behavior and shame to control self-image. A person who believes they are broken is easier to influence. They are more likely to seek approval, accept blame, and tolerate mistreatment. Over time, repeated exposure to shame can erode self-confidence and create a cycle of dependency. Gaslighting is one of the most discussed but least understood tactics. It involves manipulating someone into doubting their own perceptions, memories, or sanity. This is not done through dramatic confrontation but through subtle, repeated denial and contradiction. Statements like "you are overreacting," "that never happened," or "you are imagining things" slowly destabilize trust in one's own mind. Once self-trust is weakened, external influence becomes stronger. The victim may begin to rely on the manipulator to define reality itself. Dark psychology also exploits cognitive biases. These are systematic errors in thinking that affect judgment. Confirmation bias leads people to seek information that supports existing beliefs. The halo effect causes positive impressions in one area to spill over into others. Scarcity bias makes things seem more valuable when they are rare or limited. By understanding these biases, a manipulator can design messages that bypass critical evaluation. Limited time offers, exclusive access, and insider knowledge all tap into these biases effectively. Another subtle tactic is intermittent reinforcement. This principle, borrowed from behavioral psychology, involves providing rewards unpredictably. The brain responds more strongly to unpredictable rewards than consistent ones. This is why gambling is addictive. Dark psychology uses intermittent approval, affection, or validation to create emotional dependence. When positive reinforcement is inconsistent, the individual works harder to obtain it. The uncertainty keeps them engaged, always hoping the next interaction will bring reward. Language itself becomes a weapon. Certain words bypass logic and trigger emotion. Absolutes such as always and never create rigid thinking. Loaded questions trap the listener into accepting false assumptions. Reframing alters perception by changing context. Saying someone failed because they lacked discipline feels different from saying they failed because the system was unfair. Both may describe the same outcome, but the emotional impact differs. Dark psychology carefully selects language to shape interpretation rather than facts. Silence can be as powerful as speech. Strategic silence creates discomfort. Humans are wired to fill gaps. When faced with silence, people often reveal more than intended. Negotiators and interrogators have long used this technique. By withholding response, the manipulator forces the other person to continue speaking, often disclosing information or conceding ground simply to relieve tension. Dark psychology is not limited to individual interactions. It scales to groups, societies, and entire populations. Propaganda uses repetition, emotional imagery, simplified narratives, and clear enemies to mobilize belief. When complex issues are reduced to moral binaries, critical thinking declines. Us versus them thinking activates tribal instincts. Once identity becomes tied to belief, challenging that belief feels like a personal attack. This is how manipulation becomes self-sustaining. One of the most dangerous aspects is that dark psychology often disguises itself as care. Controlling behavior may be framed as protection. Surveillance may be framed as concern. Restriction may be framed as guidance. When control is disguised as love or responsibility, resistance feels like betrayal. This is particularly effective in close relationships, where emotional bonds already exist. The line between influence and abuse becomes blurred. The ethical boundary is not always clear. Influence itself is not inherently evil. Teaching, leadership, persuasion, and motivation all involve influencing others. Dark psychology crosses the line when it removes informed consent and prioritizes control over well-being. The difference lies in intent and transparency. Education empowers. Manipulation conceals. Understanding dark psychology is not about learning how to control others. It is about recognizing when control is being applied. Awareness restores choice. When you understand the tactics, their power diminishes. The brain can slow down, question emotional reactions, and reassert autonomy. This is why education is the most effective defense. Self-awareness is the first shield. Recognizing emotional triggers reduces their impact. If fear makes you rush decisions, pause when you feel afraid. If praise makes you compliant, notice when flattery appears. Emotional regulation strengthens resistance. The more grounded you are in your own values and identity, the less leverage manipulators have. Critical thinking is another defense. Question certainty. Ask who benefits. Examine sources. Seek multiple perspectives. Manipulation thrives in isolation and ambiguity. Transparency and dialogue disrupt it. When information flows freely, deception struggles to survive. Boundaries are essential. Dark psychology often targets those with weak boundaries. Learning to say no without justification is a powerful skill. You are not required to explain or defend your limits. Respect for boundaries is a sign of healthy interaction. Repeated pressure is a warning signal. It is also important to recognize that anyone can use dark psychological tactics, often unconsciously. Cultural norms, upbringing, and personal insecurities shape behavior. The goal is not to label people as villains but to understand dynamics. Awareness fosters responsibility. As the documentary unfolds, one truth becomes clear. Darkness in psychology does not mean evil lurking in the mind. It means unexamined mechanisms operating without awareness. Light does not eliminate these mechanisms. It reveals them. When revealed, they lose their mystique and much of their power. The human mind is remarkable. It can create art, empathy, innovation, and connection. It can also rationalize harm, obey destructive authority, and surrender autonomy. Dark psychology exists at this intersection. It reminds us that knowledge is neutral, but application is not. The same understanding that can manipulate can also protect. Education transforms fear into clarity. Suspense dissolves into insight. The shadows recede when examined closely. What remains is responsibility. To understand is to choose wisely. To see is to refuse blindness. In a world saturated with influence, awareness is not optional. It is survival. And so the room is no longer silent. It is filled with understanding. Darkness loses its grip not through denial, but through knowledge. The greatest secret of dark psychology is not how it controls minds, but how easily it loses power when exposed.